You're listening to the Climate Dispatch podcast, presented by Sierra Club Angeles Chapter and Stranded Astronaut Productions. Available everywhere you listen to podcasts, we cover the stories of the climate crisis, from celebrating the wins to breaking down our fears, all while sharing collective hopes for the future. I'm your host, Taya Jeanette, and this week we're taking the conversation outside, exploring the beauty of the great outdoors, the historical barriers to accessing them, and how we can create an equitable conservation movement. Every 30 seconds, the United States loses a football field-sized piece of land to urban development, extractive industry, and human activity. In the face of climate change, mass extinction, and widespread ecological degradation, environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, have called for a 30 by 30 approach to conservation, preserving 30% of natural land and water by 2030. Our open green spaces, from expansive U.S. national parks to your favorite local garden, play a major role in helping us forge bonds with the natural landscape. Connecting with nature on a personal level has a number of benefits, physically and emotionally, but millions of Americans face barriers to enjoying access to the outdoors. A major part in achieving our 30 by 30 conservation goal is creating a more inclusive conservation movement and rebuilding relationships with nature across communities. In order to do this, the conservation field is confronting some of its more complicated roots. To understand how we can protect nature for everyone and address the barriers to accessing the outdoors, we might first need to look back at the history of the conservation movement and examine how, why, and where we form a bond with nature.
I did not have a sense of the importance of the public lands until I went to college in the Northwest, and then during college I had a Student Conservation Association internship in southern Utah studying desert tortoises.
Michelle Nijhuis, an acclaimed science writer, has spent years studying and writing about conservation.
And I have a very clear memory of the penny dropping and looking out on all of this BLM land and thinking, wow, this is public land. Wow. The grandeur and the scope of that public land has fascinated me ever since. And the politics surrounding it, the sort of ongoing generational argument, debate, conversation about how we steward our public lands has fascinated me, and I've thought about it and written about it ever since.
That fascination led to years of scientific writing that culminated in the publishing of her book, Beloved Beast, focused on the history of the conservation movement and when and why we started to conserve animals and natural spaces.
The conservation movement, and here I'm speaking about what you might call the institutional conservation movement or the modern conservation movement, which started in the late 19th century by most measures, and was motivated really by the threat of global extinction, which was a relatively new concept at the time. But that movement has accomplished a lot. It's accomplished a lot of things that we have a difficult time appreciating because there's so much a part of our lives. You know, without the conservation movement, we would not have, for instance, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is responsible for protecting most songbirds from extinction. So I think it's important to appreciate those victories. I think the institutional conservation movement has certainly made a lot of mistakes, in part because of its roots as a very elite movement. There's a lot of reliance. I still see a lot of reliance on top-down conservation, in part because the founders of the conservation movement were people who, took presidents out for lunch. They were used to having top-down access, so that's what they were, inclined to grab for first, and that, I think, still affects some of the strategic thinking in the movement.
The modern conservation movement that started around the mid-1800s was a Eurocentric-dominated field, primarily led by men who were enamored by the beauty of natural spaces. But the leaders of the movement, like John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and John James Audubon, also played into racist, anti-Indigenous, and exclusionary politics of their times. While their intentions were based around preserving these natural spaces, and it's hard not to celebrate the direct results of their actions, the strategies for doing so often neglected the long-standing stewardship of Indigenous groups, and yearned for a pure nature, which in many ways separated humans from that nature.
From a U.S. perspective, many of our large, not all, but many of our large environmental groups were founded by people of wealth who wanted to protect amazing landscapes because, they truly appreciated the beauty of wild creatures. They truly appreciated, I'm not trying to say these were not genuine feelings on their part, but often did not appreciate that these were landscapes that had a human history as well. And so it has taken the institutional conservation movement quite a few generations to come around to the fact that, these places that we think we have protected for future generations have a human history, were in many ways shaped by Indigenous peoples for millennia before we even thought about protecting them. And also those traditions that we disrupted with our conservation measures contain a lot of conservation knowledge that is very useful to all of us today. And we saw this dynamic played out in the U.S. in the establishment of the national parks where Indigenous peoples were driven out in order to establish the parks. And then that strategy was exported when the conservation movement moved out of Europe and North America and went worldwide. A lot of the parks established in Africa, for instance, were established in places that were already deeply inhabited by people with their own conservation traditions. And those parks often had a disastrous effect on people's livelihoods and their own connection with the natural world.
It's a sensitive topic. John Muir, who founded Sierra Club, is a major reason why we have national parks today, and much of the conservation field owes the preserved land and water we have to these movement leaders. Within the context of their important work, it's difficult to acknowledge the darker side of this history. But when we refuse to confront these truths, we continue to exclude the same groups that these leaders effectively displaced and kept from their visions of a pure nature.
The institutional conservation movement, and here I'm speaking in the U.S. and worldwide, is doing a lot of the right things, is moving in the right direction in a lot of ways, and it is not moving quickly enough to meet some of the emergencies we face. I'm not sure if that is possible, but I would say I really take hope from the direction that the conservation movement in general on a global scale is moving. Even since I wrote Beloved Beasts back in 2021, it's grown just exponentially. There's real action happening.
Part of that action is coming from the very groups who owe their founding to these conservationists, including the Sierra Club, which has been on an equity journey for years. Allison Chin, Sierra Club president and chair of the board, has witnessed the changing times over her dedicated leadership within the organization.
I was the first person of color to become a Sierra Club president or chair of the board. It's been a journey. It definitely has been a journey as we grapple with our own history and, iconic figures like John Muir.
John Muir founded Sierra Club in 1892 with an intense passion to conserve the natural landscapes he'd witnessed. The story goes that John Muir visited Yosemite in a time when commercial interest in the land was exceedingly high following the gold rush. He was immediately immersed in its beauty. The rushing waterfalls, the towering steep cliff sides, the meadows of blooming flowers, each corner he turned appeared to have a new discovery waiting behind it. In 1889, John Muir played a huge role in drawing the boundary of the Sierra Nevada mountain range that would become the Yosemite National Park and forever preserve the land. The problem is, this land already had a name, Ahwahnee, a name provided by the Ahwahneechee tribe who had already been stewarding the landscape for years before colonizers arrived in California.
I think where Sierra Club realized we had to lean in was to think about what it would take for this organization to be more welcoming and inclusive of many people from many different backgrounds and walks of life who had their own truths and connections with the land. We didn't all have to just go through one path, if you will, to reach the mountaintops.
In 2020, Sierra Club took a controversial step to confront their founder's more problematic beliefs, like his documented derogatory comments about Black and Indigenous people, in something of an uproar to the conservationists who adore the organization and its founder. The statement by then Executive Director Michael Brune also confronted the white supremacist and eugenics leaders who had been early members of the organization. Brune pledged to continue to acknowledge these harms in an effort to make the now much more diverse Sierra Club membership continue to feel welcomed within the conservation community, and to invest even more intentionally in environmental justice. Systemic racism within conservation and this idea that nature was for one kind of person has haunted the narrative of the conservation field for over a century. This early discrimination has led to a long-standing nature gap for BIPOC communities, in which communities of color are less likely to have access to green spaces. Fortunately for Allison, her dad was adamant about sharing his personal love for the great outdoors with his family.
I was lucky. My dad took us to the national parks every summer growing up. So I grew up just expecting to always have access to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. It was a place where I could recreate, explore, learn, and just be myself. Dad would pack up the car with 3 kids and, all the gear. He kind of thought of it as a meal to meal, and we just had a blast. We would just play, explore, learn how to hike, learn how to cook over a campfire or a stove, and really learn to enjoy the crisp air, the pristine nights, the rushing rivers. And that just, became an indelible mark on my body. In the 80s, when the public parks became threatened, that activated all my senses to really look for support to fight for the protection of public lands. And again, it was all just forged from those early camping trips. If you and your family, your community don't have a relationship with the outdoors, with the parks, you won't know them, right? Unless someone introduces you to them.
Not everyone is as lucky as Allison to be introduced to nature and form a connection with it at such a young age, especially when considering the systemic barriers to access.
I didn't grow up outdoors. My parents never really took me outdoors. If anything, it was the park.
Ariel Dela Cruz is an outdoors educator and Sierra Club Angeles chapter board member, whose love for nature was formed into her early adulthood.
And I really got to know the outdoors in college. And for me, it was like an out. I was really taking these super intense classes because I was going to school for pre-med and I needed something fun. And I luckily found these courses of like backpacking and kayaking and mountaineering, and having that connection with the outdoors really got me into this work and wanting to protect it. National parks and state parks are highly prized, but it's like really these greens, like these small pockets of green spaces in our neighborhoods that should be more prioritized, because we don't always have, the time and space and resources to go, further outdoors, to the mountains, to the deserts.
It's not just the history of exclusion hidden within the outdoors and conservation fields that's impacting marginalized communities. It's also the prevalent environmental racism of infrastructure. BIPOC communities are 3 times more likely to live in nature-deprived spaces when compared to white communities, and over 76% of BIPOC communities are being stripped of their rights to green spaces through fossil fuel infrastructure and development. On top of that, the pollution from these industries impacts access to clean air and water, compounding the barriers to the outdoors. Sierra Club, alongside confronting its history, has also been developing programs that connect communities back to nature. The organization's Inspiring Connections Outdoors, or ICO program, leads outdoors excursions with underserved youth to provide experiences that form those early bonds with nature, like Allison had with her family. The program facilitates more than 900 outings for up to 14,000 youth annually.
I became a leader with a program called Inspiring Connections Outdoors, which was really about, providing opportunities to experience the outdoors, again, whether it's a neighborhood park to, I learned to cross-country ski on one of these ICO outings, and I figured I just needed to stay up on those skis a few seconds longer than some of the participants so I could help them down the trail. But it was really about helping folks with maybe equipment, gear, and then as outings leaders, being able to provide safe outings for folks to have the experience and fall in love with it on their own terms.
Ariel has similarly hosted opportunities for youth to get outdoors, whether it's through guided hikes or community gardens, in hopes that they can develop a kinship with nature early in life.
For the past 3 to 4 years, I have primarily taken youth outdoors, and these youth have been part of the school that I work with, which is in downtown Long Beach. And when you think about the demographics there, they don't really get the access to the outdoors. For me, providing these experiences to my youth has been one of my most fulfilling experiences as I've gone on these trips with them, hearing them say like, oh my gosh, I love this. I want to take my family out here. They will remember that trip that Miss Ariel took them on.
I think that's really special, and these kids are very lucky to have Miss Ariel to take them on these trips.
These trips are all about them. It's all about how they feel connected to it. You want to protect the places that make you feel loved and that love you right back.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
When I first started doing this, and I would talk about climate change, it was like another subject, like geology, hydrology, meteorology, and it was well received. And then at some point it got politicized.
What made climate change political was the most comprehensive, longest-running propaganda campaign in U.S. history. I'm Amy Westervelt, the host of Drilled, a true crime podcast about climate change. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, back to our conversation with author Michelle Nijhuis and Sierra Club representatives Allison Chin and Ariel Dela Cruz. There are very genuine and real impacts to our natural spaces that are happening right now, but these landscapes have also been here for so much longer than we can imagine, even before they were preserved in a specific area that was called Sequoia National Park. There were sequoias there. And there's this school of thought around how humans are allowed to interact with nature, how we're supposed to. And I think that that can often be a bit of a barrier for how we ourselves can connect with nature, whether or not we're doing it correctly.
Well, I will say that there is a strain of pessimism in the conservation movement, pessimism about people. And I understand that. If you work on the front lines of the conservation movement, you see horrible behavior by people all the time. It's not a surprise that people come out of those experiences with pessimism about their fellow members of the human race. But I do think it's so important to recognize that, yes, humans are part of, whether you're talking about climate change or conservation or, any kind of planetary crisis, humans are part of the problem, a big part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution. And I mean, there is no conservation without people, right? It's a human endeavor. So we need to be clearer about I think, as people care about conservation, we need to be clearer about the positive ways people can interact with the natural world. If I could assign one piece of reading to every conservationist, it would be the work of Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize-winning political scientist who studied the ways in which traditional societies have figured out ways to manage their own resources. And it's such a powerful pushback against the idea of the inevitability of the tragedy of the commons. If people are left to themselves with a limited resource, they're just going to use it all up willy-nilly. That does happen. If you've been in a traffic jam, you know that it happens, but it doesn't have to happen. And I guess I find that just deeply inspiring, that and it does sustain me through those moments when I do feel like, oh gosh, people are part of the, how are we ever going to get ourselves out of this mess we created? Just to know that it's possible and it's been done, I find really helpful.
There's also some humility for us as humans to think about our place, maybe our imbalanced place in the ecosystem, because it is such a delicate balance. And as we think about the resources we use and how we steward the resources that remain, is really, there's so much to learn from particularly the Indigenous folks who have inhabited this land for millennia. So I think that's also part of what's driven, organizations to do that deep reflection is, where have we come from, where have we been, and what is our responsibility and role, right? Even going forward together. Because at the end of the day, it is about stewarding a planet that, provides resources for all of us, and refuge and safety and, habitat. So I think that's really important.
The conservation movement has been a human-driven movement, and it's an example of the significant role we can play in protecting the planet. Part of manifesting that care for the environment, the great outdoors, these beautiful natural landscapes, is being able to witness them and build a connection and relationship to them directly. But we can't always visit areas that are imperiled or witness species that are endangered, not just because of geographical limitations, but in the cases where our presence wouldn't serve these species. One way we've found to widen the access points for developing our connection to nature is through new tools and technologies in storytelling, from bird cams to BBC nature documentaries. These help bridge the gap between audiences and remote threatened habitats and species. Take, for example, the polar bear, an animal that's become something of a poster child for conservation in the context of the climate crisis. For most of us, we didn't discover our love for polar bears from witnessing them in our own backyards, but instead from the videos and photos shared by conservationists to the wider population. These tools have created an extension of nature and become an important pillar in engaging more people to care about species in natural spaces that they might not have had a relationship to before. I think technology is something that specifically has, in some ways, influenced the human belief that we are very separate from nature. But in a lot of ways, in a very interesting way, it can also bring us back to nature in a way that can call on more people to care for restoring it and protecting it. How do you see this kind of creating a balance between how we can protect nature while also continuing to restore our own connection with it?
I've been thinking a lot about this, that everything is a tool. And just like social media and whatnot, but especially technology, it is a tool. So either you use it to your benefit or to destroy. And it is really hard because, the further along that we get with advancements of technology, depending on what it is and what it takes and consumes, it can send us down a bad road, or it can also send us to a place where we can learn more. Right now, when you mentioned, about the bison and, learning more about it, right now there's bald eagle chicks in Big Bear. And we would not experience that without technology and modernization. And I want to honor that we're at this place. Advancements and technology, we don't always have access, to be able to even see a bison. I haven't even seen a bison, but I'm able to view it online and to learn more about it. But that it's a resource, but at the same time, it's a very slippery slope of how we choose to move forward with it.
Well, I will say that owning a little birdhouse with a camera in it has drastically improved my life.
great.
In ways that I didn't expect. I never knew how much fun it would be to look at common birds on a daily basis and watch their little interactions. So I think some of these things like the bird cams and even, these tiny tracking technologies that allow not only scientists but ordinary people to see where the animals go can be just a wonderful new dimension in our experience with it of other species and the rest of life. But I think of it kind of like I started to think of Zoom happy hours during COVID. It ultimately extremely unsatisfying, better than nothing, but ultimately unsatisfying. And it's got to be an addition to the lived experience and not a replacement for it. And, I think maybe it's one route of accessibility, like we were talking about. Maybe the sight of bald eagle chicks can inspire someone to, go somewhere where they can see adult bald eagles flying overhead. And, for other people who already have those experiences, it can be just a new dimension.
Videos of birdhouses and nestling eagles have gone viral on social media platforms, reflecting a new form of connecting with and accessing nature. While it might not be a replacement for the benefits of experiencing nature in real life, it can be an important piece of raising awareness for endangered species and conserving that 30% of land and water by 2030.
It might seem like a bit of an obvious question, but why is it important to preserve natural spaces in the context of the climate crisis, in the context of accessibility and everything that we've talked about? Why do we need to be supporting the programs that continue forth with conservation?
Well, I think there are all kinds of instrumental arguments about how we are air breathers and water drinkers and we need food that comes from healthy soil that you're talking about, Allison. I've always I've spent most of my adult life in places where the landscape is much, much bigger than I am. Hopefully we've all had opportunities to go to places where you can kind of forget yourself in a way, forget your concerns get to seem smaller. The concerns of your circle of the people around you get to seem a little bit smaller, and you get a sense of just the grand scale of space and time on this planet. And, I think that, along with all the other practical, moral, and ethical reasons that we need to protect these places, that is really important because it helps us in the work of protecting them. What I hope the conservation movement is heading toward is that it is as diverse and complex and as interconnected as the ecosystems it aims to protect.
It starts with one of us, right? And gets amplified by the many of us if we will coordinate and live with mutuality and humility for one another.
Humans are the people who are creating these problems, but we are also the ones who can create solutions. And understanding that we do have the power, just as Allison mentioned. And Taya, you were mentioning, or you asked, why does it matter? And when I think about the earth and what she's going through, she needs land. She needs water. She needs these areas. And without these areas, if it was just full of urban development and whatever organizations and companies are doing with our land, like, how can she do that? And I wish people just understood a little bit more of what they have is because of the earth. When you say the word outdoors or nature, someone has an idea of what that person's supposed to look like, supposed to be like, what do they do, what kind of gear they may have. And I want that everyone feels that they can be that person who enjoys and appreciates the outdoors. It's not just one set of people or demographic or income level. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, right? We talk a lot about accessibility, but it's the sense of a belonging, that they belong in the outdoors. I think a lot of people don't feel like that they belong in these spaces sometimes, especially with the history of conservation and environmental work. And for me, that's what it looks like, an equitable future looks like, that they feel that they belong here, that they deserve to be here, and that they need to be here.
Humans exist within the integrated parts of a living ecosystem, and we can and must see ourselves as interconnected with nature. The reality is, we're facing the sixth mass extinction brought on by harmful human activity. While humans might be the cause, we can also be part of the solution by continuing to conserve natural spaces and protecting the environment for all species on Earth. This starts by building a relationship with nature and making sure every person has the opportunity to do so. To quote Dan Ritzman, the Lands, Water, and Wildlife Director for Sierra Club's Our Wild America campaign, nature is not just an escape for the wealthy and white, as dangerously implied by early preservationists. Access to nature is a human right, and preserving it is unequivocally imperative in fighting the climate crisis. The environmental movement will take all of us, united and unwavering, to save our planet and everyone on it.
Hi, it's Megan from the Sierra Club Angeles chapter, here with your weekly call to action. This week, we discussed how crucial it is to get people outside and into nature to help them form relationships with our planet so that they are more inspired to protect it. The Angeles chapter works hard to provide these opportunities for everyone, and you can help us continue this vital work. Donate online today at sc.org/more to explore. That's sc.org/more to explore. From first hikes to lifelong passion, your support gives people the opportunity to enjoy our beautiful planet.
Thanks for listening to the Climate Dispatch podcast. I'm your host, Taya Jeanette, and playing us off into the great unknown is Strange Pilgrim, with their song, Staring at the Sky.
As we came up, the sun went down. Leaves were shaking. And we started feeling strange. Feet vibrating. Staring at the sky, jasmine floating in the air. We were staring at the sky, the stars and the moon. The ground beneath became the sea. In the faded golden light, at the time it seemed so real. We drifted on into the night. We were staring at the sky, laughing at our lives. We were staring at the sky. We may be tired, but we're alright.
Climate Dispatch is a production of Stranded Astronaut and the Sierra Club Angeles chapter, produced by myself, Tay Jeanette, Meg Pruce, and Megan Spatz. Audio engineering and editing by Maxfield Biggs, original theme music and score by Phil Hamilton, and graphics by Cyrus Marlo Sama.